The crystal chandelier above the private dining room shimmered against polished silverware as my grandfather tapped his spoon against a champagne glass. "I'm so proud of how you've handled the $70,000 I set aside for you." The room laughed softly. My cousins nodded with fake admiration. My mother lowered her eyes into her wine glass. And I just sat there because I had never seen a single dollar of it. The silence hit me before the humiliation did. Thick, heavy, the kind that makes every tiny sound feel violent. The scrape of a fork, ice shifting inside a glass, someone clearing their throat too quickly. My grandfather's smile slowly faded. "What do you mean?" he asked after I didn't react. I looked directly at my mother first, then my uncle, then back at him. "What 70,000? The temperature in the room changed instantly. My uncle nearly dropped his drink. My mother's face drained of colour so fast it looked rehearsed. Across the table, my younger cousin stopped chewing mid-bite. Grandpa blinked twice, confused, then reached into the inside pocket of his blazer with trembling fingers. He unfolded copies of bank transfers, trust documents, account statements, all dated across 8 years. My name was on every page, but the signatures weren't mine. I remember staring at the papers while the low jazz music from the restaurant continued, playing outside the room like nothing was happening, like families weren't quietly detonating behind closed doors. My mother finally whispered, "This isn't the place." But it was exactly the place, because for years I'd been called irresponsible, careless with money, not ambitious enough. Every time I struggled through community college while working night shifts, they looked at me with subtle disappointment, as if I had wasted some golden opportunity everyone else knew about except me. And suddenly I understood why. Someone at that table had stolen my future and built a family narrative around my silence. I grew up being treated like the unfinished version of everyone else in the family. My grandfather built hotels across 3 states and carried himself like the kind of man people stood up for when he entered a room. My uncle inherited his confidence. My cousins inherited his money. And my mother inherited his ability to survive by keeping quiet. I inherited nothing people could photograph. By 24, I was juggling warehouse shifts, freelance editing jobs, and night classes I could barely afford. At family gatherings, my cousins discussed investment portfolios while I calculated whether my gas tank could survive until payday. Nobody openly mocked me anymore. That would have required noticing me enough to care. Instead, they used softer weapons. "Still figuring things out? You've always been different. Some people just aren't built for pressure." I learned early that disappointment sounds gentler when served with expensive wine. The strange part was my grandfather never treated me cruelly. Distant, yes. Busy, always. But whenever we spoke privately, he seemed genuinely confused by the gap between my potential and my circumstances. He'd ask why I was still renting a cramped apartment, or why I never finished university sooner. I thought he simply compared me to the rest of the family and found me lacking. Now, sitting in that private dining room with forged signatures spread across the table, I realized something colder. For years, they hadn't just underestimated me. They had carefully managed the version of me he was allowed to see. Once I started looking back carefully, the pattern became impossible to ignore. My uncle had always insisted on helping me with financial paperwork because, according to him, I was creative, not detail-oriented. He said it jokingly, usually while squeezing my shoulder hard enough to feel possessive. At the time, I thought it was harmless. Now I remembered every document he volunteered to handle, every missing envelope, every conversation redirected before I could ask questions. At holidays, my cousins loved telling stories about their internships, luxury apartments, and startup investments while casually asking whether I was still doing delivery work. They never sounded openly cruel. That was what made it effective. Their pity came polished and socially acceptable. Even my mother participated in quieter ways. Whenever Grandpa praised me for surviving on so little, she would immediately change the subject. Sometimes I caught panic in her expression, quick. Flashes behind her smile that vanished before anyone else noticed. I used to mistake that look for embarrassment. Now I understood it was fear. 3 nights after the graduation dinner, Grandpa invited me alone to his house. The estate felt unusually silent without the usual family noise filling it. In his office, he placed decades of financial records across the desk between us with careful precision. Neither of us spoke much. But with every page I turned, the betrayal became less accidental and more architectural. The final piece clicked into place when I found the tax filings, not the forged signatures, not the hidden transfers, the taxes. My uncle had been moving money from the trust into shell accounts for years, but he'd made one mistake. wealthy people often make after getting comfortable for too long. He assumed nobody beneath him would ever look closely enough to understand the paperwork. But years of surviving on too little had made me careful. Precise. I sat alone in Grandpa's office past midnight, the green banker's lamp casting sharp light across stacks of documents while rain pressed softly against the windows. The house felt almost hollow around me. That was when I saw my mother's name, not as the thief, as the witness. Every transfer had required secondary acknowledgement from someone inside the family office. She had signed nearly all of them, small signatures hidden in corners most people would never notice. I finally understood why she avoided my eyes whenever money came up. She knew, maybe not at first, maybe not completely, but enough. Grandpa sat silently across from me as I organized the papers into neat piles. He looked older than I had ever seen him, smaller somehow. "You were supposed to receive everything at 21, he said quietly. I nodded once, and in that moment, something inside me stopped wanting explanations. I didn't want apologies anymore. I wanted the truth documented, so carefully that nobody in the family could escape it with charm. Excuses or silence ever again. I didn't threaten anyone. That was the first thing that unsettled them. No angry calls. No dramatic confrontations. No social media posts designed to embarrass the family. I simply became quiet in a different way, focused instead of defeated. Grandpa gave me temporary access to the family financial archives and introduced me to the attorney who had structured the original trust years earlier. Her name was Evelyn Ross, a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and the kind of calm expression that made people accidentally confess things. She treated me seriously from the beginning. That alone changed something in me. Over the next 3 weeks, I built timelines, transfer histories, signature comparisons, property purchases that suddenly made sense once the missing trust. Money was traced through shell companies connected to my uncle. The amount wasn't just 70,000 anymore. Investment growth, diverted dividends, and concealed assets had quietly transformed it into something far larger. Enough to ruin reputations, enough to trigger criminal investigations. But I wasn't interested in spectacle. I knew people like my uncle survived chaos easily. They lied instinctively inside emotional situations. What they feared was documentation, patience, precision. So I let him relax. At Sunday dinners, I still smiled politely while he poured wine and spoke over everyone. My mother barely touched her food anymore. Sometimes I noticed her watching me carefully, like she was waiting for the explosion she thought was coming. But revenge works best when nobody notices the doors quietly locking around them. The family meeting happened 6 weeks later in my grandfather's main conference room overlooking the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the storm clouds gathering outside, turning the glass black by early evening. Everyone arrived assuming it was about Grandpa's retirement plans. My uncle even brought a bottle of expensive bourbon as if confidence alone could control the room. Then Evelyn placed the binders on the table, 4 of them, perfectly labelled. No speeches followed, no accusations, just paper sliding across polished wood while rain tapped softly against the windows. I watched my uncle's expression change page by page. Confusion first, then concentration, then fear. Real fear is quieter than people imagine. It appears in small things, the way someone loosens their tie twice in under a minute, or rereads a paragraph they already understand because their brain is buying time. My mother started crying before anyone spoke. Grandpa remained completely still at the head of the table while Evelyn explained the forged authorizations, hidden transfers, falsified reporting, and tax exposure with surgical calm. Criminal referrals had already been prepared. Asset freezes were pending. My uncle tried denying it once, just once. Then Evelyn opened the final binder, containing signature analyses and recorded authorization calls tied directly to him. After that, the room became almost unbearably silent. I didn't say much the entire night. I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, the truth occupied more space in the room than the family narrative ever had. The collapse didn't happen all at once. Families like ours rarely explode publicly. They erode quietly behind closed doors, where reputations matter more than honesty. Within a month, my uncle resigned from 3 company boards for personal reasons. Friends who once laughed too loudly at his jokes suddenly stopped returning his calls. The same relatives who defended him for years began speaking about him carefully, as if betrayal were contagious. My mother moved into a smaller apartment across town. We spoke only twice after the investigation became official. During the second call, she admitted she noticed inconsistencies years earlier, but convinced herself it was temporary. that my uncle would eventually fix everything before anyone got hurt. But people always say that when the victim is someone easier to sacrifice. The strange part was realizing the money itself no longer mattered most to me. What haunted me was how easily everyone accepted the version of me they were given. The struggling disappointment, the irresponsible grandson, the family failure who supposedly squandered opportunity. Nobody asked questions because the story was convenient. And that's why this kind of betrayal matters. Not because of wealth, because once people decide who deserves respect and who doesn't, they stop looking closely at injustice happening directly in front of them. I spent years doubting myself simply because other people found it useful. A year later, I finished my degree without working overnight shifts for the first time in my life. The trust was restored after the legal settlements cleared, though the process left scars across the family that would probably never fully heal. Some relatives stopped speaking to each other entirely. Others tried rebuilding connections slowly, carefully, like people walking through broken glass barefoot. Grandpa changed the most. He retired earlier than planned and spent more time away from boardrooms and charity dinners. Sometimes we had breakfast together. On Sundays without discussing the investigation at all. Just coffee, newspapers, and long stretches of comfortable silence. For years, I thought success meant finally proving I belonged in rooms like his. Now I understand peace is something quieter. It's checking my bank account without panic tightening my chest. It's signing my own documents. It's no longer apologizing for surviving circumstances I never created. People imagine revenge as destruction because that's what movies teach us. But the most satisfying revenge I ever experienced was much smaller than that. I became impossible to rewrite. The family spent years building a false story around my life until they almost convinced me it was true too. But eventually, the lies collapsed under the weight of simple evidence and patience. And in the end, the loudest thing I ever did was finally refuse to carry their version of me any longer.